Development and learning is a huge theme, of course. Any of the themes we treat of in this course could be expanded indefinitely into an entire program all by itself. Any attempt to understand who we are, whether our focus is on behavior or whether our focus is more experiential or whether we have a more disinterested perspective, the themes that arise in studying development and learning are going to be relevant. In our very brief survey of the history of psychology, we sojourned for a while in behaviorism, where the acquisition of behavior became almost a sole focus. But with the advent of cognitive psychology in its modern form, with the advent of alternatives these days in connectionist models, in embodied approaches to cognition, these themes have not gone away. They never will go away. So to the extent that we see ourselves as continuous with these kind of squawking, helpless animals, we'll want to know what they are and how they come to be what they are. We also carry a great deal of guilt around with us. We want to know when something goes wrong, was it us? Was our kid born bad? And so the very first thing to say is there's no nature-nurture dichotomy. Okay. If you get one thing out of this lecture, please don't take any behavior and ask, oh, I wonder, was that acquired or was it innate? Was the kid born like that or was it the parents? This makes no sense. It cannot be supported. There is no nature-nurture dichotomy. And furthermore, the suggestion that one can partition oneself into a biological self and a cultural self is a fantasy that undermines an awful lot of very poor discussion in our society. It comes about from suggesting that phylogenesis is distinct from ontogenesis. Phylogenesis is the process of evolution that gave rise to anatomically modern humans. Anatomically modern humans are only about 200,000 years old. And you may feel you have no part of this. You're wrong. You very much have a part of this. You have one individual role to play, as every living creature has had. Ontogenesis is the development of a single individual from the moment of fusion of the two cells into a single cell, right up to birth and beyond. So birth is just one more thing that happens to you. It's kind of a significant one, but you know, there's a new series of Better Call Saul as well. It's also important. There used to be a fond notion, which has its roots in German Romanticism, expressed as ontogenesis recapitulates phylogenesis. That is, as we trace the various stages of an embryo and a fetus right up to the mature individual, what we are doing is somehow recapitulating the evolutionary history. So you can see there's shades of a tail in the early stages there, and there's gills, for example, that form in a human that then close up. But that is a fanciful notion. The process of symmetry breaking that gives rise to a differentiated, highly specific form lends itself to this kind of misinterpretation. It's necessary that we go from a very ill-defined, if your starting point is a single cell, and we're talking about the life of a single organism, its starting point is a single cell, that's necessarily somewhat lacking in differentiation. And clearly the path from there to a fully differentiated organism with very many organs, very many tissue types and so on is going to be a complex path. But that doesn't mean that it's going to play out, as it were, in fast forward the history of evolution. That's not actually going to happen. So we can distinguish between processes of phylogenesis and ontogenesis. What we cannot do is look at your behavior and say that bit is because of phylogenesis and the other bit is because of ontogenesis. What you do today depends on both your ontogeny and your phylogeny, necessarily in every respect. You do not partition in this way. And supposing you go out and you learn a whole new skill set today, and you learn something which is not motivated from a Darwinian point of view at all. You go out there and you learn to ride a unicycle and juggle. Well, good for you. It's just as much, your ability to do that lies in phylogenesis just as much as in ontogenesis. Your starting point that makes the somewhat absurd goal of riding a unicycle and juggling accessible is only possible because of a long history of evolution that left you where you are. But we have a habit when we're telling stories about ourselves of trying to insist on simple dichotomies. And we've met many of them. This is a theme throughout this lecture course where we've recognized various dichotomies and tried to avoid choosing sides, rather to recognize as we look at, for example, rationalist versus empiricist concerns in any given situation. As we consider question of being from the point of view of Parmenides or Heraclitus, to go right back to the very beginning. These are not sides that we want to pick in a football match. These open up a territory to us in which we can recognize multiple competing influences, and we can turn our attention now here and now there. We can focus now on phylogenesis, now on ontogenesis, but that's not to claim that they are clearly separable, just as biology and culture are not clearly separable. So while there's been a lot of discussion about whether such and such an ability is innate or acquired, such questions inevitably run into the sand if they're taken too literally. They end up as pitting the genes against the TV set, right? Biology against culture. We won't get anywhere like that. Nature versus nurture is a dead end. That doesn't mean we can't attend to genetic contributions, that we can't attend to both phylogenesis and ontogenesis, sometimes more, sometimes less. But the insistence that you can drive a wedge between these tends to have more of a theological motivation than a scientific motivation. And inevitably, of course, it's the desire to come up with simple stories. Black and white is always easier than shades of grey, right? So there's quite a lot of interesting required reading for this week. One of them is a good blog post here, which points out that when we think of genes and a genome, we tend to think of that as if an organism owned the genome. But a genome, any genome, only makes sense in a specific environment. And the effect of the genes to turn on and off various processes of protein building, for example, is done in interaction with an environment. Absent the environment, the genes are meaningless. So there's no such thing as an organism considered without an environment. A telling example I've been running through my mind recently is the simplest cybernetic system possible is a thermostat. Supposing you came across a thermostat in the wild. You all know what a thermostat is. It maintains the temperature within a specific range, very much in a manner highly simplified, but not unlike very many biological processes that serve the continued existence of an organism. Supposing you were out there in the wild and you found a thermostat, and you took it out, you carved it out, and you took it home, and you put it in a climate-controlled environment because you saw that it was sensitive to temperature change, and you wanted to study it. It wouldn't make any sense anymore. When you take the thermostat out of its environment in which it co-varies with its environment, if you eventually break that link, you don't have anything to study anymore. Organisms are very much of this nature. Tomasello has said fish are born expecting water and humans are born expecting culture. I like to think of our culture as being very much like the products and weird, bizarre practices, Lady Gaga's meat dress at the awards and so on. It's just like spiders spinning webs. I don't know what spiders think of their own webs. I'm sure that they're very proud of them and so on, but do they see them the way? They don't see them the way we see them, for sure. We can't stand outside ourselves either, but we can recognize that all humans at all times have come up with practices that are, well, frankly, bizarre. Highly structured, shall we say. Interesting. and that have given rise to all that we understand about human society. When we look at human development as a process, as something that is extended over time, and that goes from throughout the entire life of the organism, then we get some sense for how interwoven these things are. Many of you will have encountered attempts to drive this wedge between nature and nurture, between ontogeny and phylogeny, in twin studies. Twin studies are beloved of developmental psychologists, and the very, very best thing for a developmental psychologist to catch identical twins which are split up at birth and raised in completely different environments. Now we're sucking diesel. This is how to do development, right? That assumes that we can interpret these in a simple fashion as if the resulting person had two different natures inside. Had a biological nature inside that was given at birth, was given the moment the sperm met the egg, and a cultural nature that was layered on like makeup through schools and parenting and jobs and such like. And you could divide the two so that you could uncover what was the biological core. It doesn't work like that. I think Vaughan Bell, who is a tremendously productive psychologist who writes a blog called Mind Hacks, put this very, very nicely. Nature versus nurture is a lie. Music is not melody versus rhythm. And wine is not grapes versus alcohol. And we are not environment versus genes. We are their sum, their products, and their expression. They dance together and we are their performance, but neither is an adversary. I think that's putting it very, very well. And the art of understanding this elegant ballet is complex and arcane, which we never realize this from reading the quoted results of genetic studies, that's these kind of twin studies, because the extent to which a trait is heritable, that is accounted for by genetics, is usually expressed as a single percentage. So that all the complexity, all this temporally extended back and forth, that together bring forth a fully developed individual, tends on some readings in some simplistic approaches to genetics to end up with hair color 60% inherited. That misses so much. Genes mean nothing without an organism in an environment. We cannot separate biology from culture in any clean way, or society from biology. And so while twin studies have their place, they need to be interpreted carefully. And finally, there's one more thing from your required reading, which is this study, which is a very, very large study combining data from 23 twin studies. So this is where we get the good meat from the twin studies. What we find out is that those abilities which were most strongly inherited, passed down from one person to the other, were the most culture dependent. That makes no sense if you think that people can be divided into a biological part and a cultural part. Those aspects which showed the greatest heritability in standard Mendelian sense were those which were most tightly connected to culture. So, go figure. With that out of the way, what kind of creature are we? Well, when we're born, we are pretty useless, right? Squawk, drink, sleep, poop. It gets better as you get older, but that's where you start off. In common with very many other animals, we are helpless at birth. We are born hairless, not seeing very well, not hearing very well. It takes humans a year to get up and take their first steps. There are lots of other animals like that. Rats and mice are also like that, and so on. But it's not that we call such helpless animals altricial. And altricial animals are dependent after birth over a certain species-specific period. They are entirely dependent on parental nurture and care. This is a luxury not all animals have. If a foal or an antelope is born, they get up and they walk. They don't have a year to learn. We call such animals precocial animals. Think of the word precocious. Precocious, when you exhibit an ability that's long before your time. the 3-year-old who sits down and plays Mozart sonatas as being precocious. And as we look across a vast range of species, we see that this is an interesting dimension, the altricial precocial spectrum, as it were. But what we find is that it doesn't lend itself to any simplistic interpretation. It's not the case that altricial animals are more intelligent than precocial animals. It's not the case that they're more sophisticated, or that animals that are more like humans are going to be more altricial. We find birds, for example, that are altricial, and we find birds that are precocial. We find mammals that are altricial, we find mammals that are precocial. We find reptiles that belong in one camp or in the other. What we do notice, however, is that this particular distinction, which we can draw, speaks volumes about the relationship between an organism or a species and the ecological niche in which it lives. If you are born on the savannah and you're an antelope, it makes good sense for you to get up and be able to walk because you'll be eaten otherwise. It's very, very simple. Right? So it's a luxury to have this time of sensitive adjustment in which you can benefit from the care and interaction with your parents, but not every animal has that luxury. But what's the effect? Well, I mentioned birth as being, yes, an important, but really just an event in a lifetime that we can trace from egg to corpse. Corpse, that's what we are, egg to corpse. Whatever you have in yourself. But if you call that an organism, then birth is something that happens, and there's a lot of stuff that happens before birth, and there's a lot of stuff that happens after birth. But if you have this period of sensitive dependence on your progenitors, you have an opportunity to flexibly adapt to the specifics of this condition or this living situation or that living situation. So precocial skills, the ones that some animals display at birth and humans take forever to get, like walk, well no, suckling is fairly good, although geez, breastfeeding seems to be ridiculously hard in Ireland, I don't know why. But walking is a good example, it takes us a year to learn to walk. These skills don't require an awful lot of fine-tuning. They're relatively invariant. Altricial animals have the opportunity of fine-tuning an awful lot of their behaviors. They can learn to walk in a way that's appropriate to one environment or another environment, not just walk. The map over there shows the distribution of the brown rat, an altricial animal born naked, blind, helpless, and dependent on its parents for care. As you can see, the brown rat lives pretty much everywhere humans live, because that map is not much different from a map that would show the distribution of humans. And very few animals on this planet have a comparable geographic distribution. The challenges an animal faces being born in a tropical jungle compared with the tundra or a desert environment, they're very, very, very different challenges. And altricial animals have this luxury that with a single biological starting point, they can then, after birth, have this short, relatively short, although in humans maybe 21 years, I don't know, ask my son, period of adjustment where they can fine-tune their skills to suit one environment or another. So the altricial animals, those which are born most helpless, tend to have the broader geographic distribution. So there's two ways of looking at this. The way that you might encounter, some people like this, but to me it smacks a little bit of human exceptionalism, is to suggest that altricial animals have flexible and adaptable behavior, and this contrasts with what we might have called instinct. I don't like the word instinct, I think it belongs in the 19th century. But that's one way that this is interpreted. Another way of looking at it, and one way I would suggest you might be slightly more enlightened, is to look at altricial animals as having a greater variety in the ways that they can interweave the form of the animal, its behaviors, and the environment in which it lives. So you've got this tight intertwining of an animal and an environment. And when we look at this now, finally, just to wrap up this little point, from a human point of view, our environment, as we'll repeatedly see, our environment isn't really the tundra or the desert or the jungle. Our environment is human society. Humans typically build buildings. They typically change the land around them. They even out climatic differences through the appropriate use of clothes and fires and such like. They engineer their environment so that they don't offer much in the way of a physical challenge. The most significant element in any human environment is other humans. And the environment, the main characteristic, main feature of the human environment is language. Language is part of the means by which we become inextricably bound into our environment. And of course, language acquisition takes a while. No other animal is going to learn anything like human language. And human language takes about 2 years, about 1.5 years for the first words for girls, and about 2 years for the first word for boys, and it goes on after that. So we need to see language as being very much a part of this. And when we move on later, and we look at some neurophysiology, possibly also some social cognition, what we'll see is that this flexible intertwining, these processes by means of which we become bound up in a specific linguistic and social and cultural environment, goes on in humans for about 21 years. That has to do with the maturation of our forebrain, with the frontal lobes, which are not finished until we're about 21 years, which is, I think, the longest maturation process of any animal that we're aware of. I don't know. So, any questions on that? Yeah.
Is it accurate to say that language is the method for the intertwining, or it is a part of it, intrinsic part of it?
It's an intrinsic part of it for sure. I'm not happy that I would be able to tell you what language is. I think we just been through that in the last couple of weeks.
You say language is part of the intertwining of...
Language is a means by which a human world arises. It's a means by which we coordinate things, adopt a shared perspective on things. Things come to have a shared significance to us, and so that we come to occupy a shared world. I think that's unique to humans.
A means to, rather, a method.
Yeah, well, it's the very fabric of, Is it just a method? Whenever the word "just" pops up, I'm careful. I'm cautious. Okay. Now, when it comes to looking at human development, processes of human development and maturation, there seems to be a consensus that we need to distinguish the child form from the adult form. Adults being, I don't know, whatever, sometime around between 16, 20, something like that. You're kind of growing up and go get a job. That seems so obvious to us. It makes me wonder. I don't know what the justification for this is. It seems to me that we learn an awful lot from that helpless starting point to the age of post-adolescence. And it looks like we don't change an awful lot thereafter. So it's quite conventional for developmental psychologists to focus on that childhood period. But you might wonder whether that's not a bias or a blind spot in ourselves. And I think there's a lot of consideration at the moment as to what does change, what are the processes of change that go on beyond that range. We're not going to go there. We're going to look at fairly standard approaches to learning and development in humans that do focus on that first 15 or 16 years. That's typically where the action is. And we're going to discuss this with relation to the work of two psychologists. And as usual, we want landmarks. We're not playing a game of one against the other, but they represent such different approaches. And I think they are, without a shadow of a doubt, the two most influential psychologists, that if we can familiarize ourselves a little bit with the approach of Piaget and Vygotsky, then we might recognize some of the variation that exists in theories of maturation and development. They were born in the same year, 1896, but they lived very different lives. Vygotsky died before he was 40, Piaget lived a great big long life. So look, one died in 1934, one died in 1980, despite them being born in the same years. Now, they were born in very different places. Piaget is a Frenchman. He was a very important figure in contributing to the turn that happened around the middle of the 20th century. As a language of information processing became available, the computer metaphor became available, the emphasis on behaviorism and the acquisition of habits faded away. Piaget was very much a part of this intellectual movement, the cognitive revolution, as it has been dubbed. And so his theories have informed cognitive psychology and education practices since the 1960s anyway. Vygotsky was born in Russia, and if you think about those dates, that was a kind of a turbulent time. We had a little bit of an old revolution going on there, and there was, the birth of communism. And this was the conditions in which he worked. And his work was initially published mainly in Russian. And it didn't come to the attention of most people in the West, as a result of all this, until about the 1970s. And only then started to trickle in. Now Vygotsky is very much flavor of the month in educational circles, for example. Now they would be seen as equally important, but the politics and history of the situation means that their ideas were introduced into cognitive psychology and cognitive science over very different times. And Piaget is much more firmly rooted there. We're still learning, to some extent, about Vygotsky. And in keeping with the difference in the social and cultural situation in which they found themselves, they viewed the human person in very different ways. Piaget looked at the individual person from a French point of view. France is the home of the birth of human rights, very strongly secular society. The French Revolution gave birth to the idea of a citizen. Piaget looks at the autonomous individual and looks at processes of maturation and change within that individual. This makes a lot of sense. If you were to consider not human development, but plant development, and you wanted to understand what happens after you plant a sunflower seed, you would notice that there's a predictable sequence of events that happens. There's first a dicotyledon, two little leaves that come up. Then there's a stalk, and then you get the mature leaves, and then that goes up, and when it reaches a certain height, there's a bud, which turns into a flower. And after the flower's been out for a while, then it turns into seeds. And if you wanted to get from one seed to the next seeds, there's no way to jump any of those stages. They will occur in that sequence, or they won't occur at all. You can't reverse or reorder those. It's kind of built in. That's the process, what we call maturation. So it's a given that there will be a certain sequence which any individual goes through, and we can learn what are the landmarks, where do we transition from one kind of point in that sequence to another kind of point. We can ask ourselves for any given ability, is it part of that sequence or not? So this business of cycling on a unicycle and juggling, for example, is something which is entirely optional as a human. You don't have to do it at any stage. And once you reach a certain level of motor capacity, you're probably as likely to learn it as you are at any future time in your life. So it's probably not really tightly tied into this sequence. Whereas, give me an example of something which is very tightly tied into the sequence. Walking, yeah. If you didn't, well, I don't know. We don't really have much in the way of examples of people who don't walk for 30 years and then get to walk. I'm thinking language. You all know the facility with which you picked up language, your first language, and how bloody difficult it is to pick up another one, right? So that focus on maturation, and in particular viewing language as part of a biological unfolding, that fitted the emerging considerations about universal grammar coming from Noam Chomsky and the computational theory of mind, which we've associated, for better or worse, with Jerry Fodor, fitted very well. So Piaget's theories of development were very well received and found resonance, and so this is yet another reason that we describe that intellectual change around the 1950s and 1960s as a very significant alteration in the way any science of the person was done. This is the cognitive turn. Now, Vygotsky was coming from a collectivist culture. He was coming from a newly formed communist state, and I'm not aware of his own political leanings, but he was very much of this nascent Soviet state. He viewed the individual as part of a collective. He was very sensitive to the fact that we come into being in the midst of all kinds of social relations, and that these social relations are absolutely essential, that you cannot pluck a person out of these social relations. So it's a huge contrast in the perspectives that they're taking. That's why I say, we've got two landmarks, and the answer is not going to be, there's not, yes, Piaget was right, or Vygotsky was right. You know, when I teach this to undergraduates, they report this back as if they were having a boxing match, and they fabricate all kinds of mythical encounters between the two, of which one lands a sucker punch on the other. It's really not like that. They did actually interact a little bit in their lives. They held each other in high regard. I'm not too well versed on where that got to, but what I want to emphasize is that they shine a light from very different angles on the developing person. And it's understandable that they do. So Piaget, given his strongly biological approach, given his focus on maturation, as sort of a natural built-in sequence of stages, he saw development as an unfolding. He described himself as a genetic epistemologist, so that what he wanted to account for as a psychologist was how do people acquire various skills, kinds of knowledge, how do they come to know about their worlds and understand their worlds in particular ways. But he saw that knowledge as being rooted in biology very strongly. And his goal was tracing the sequencing that goes on in any given individual from the kind of sensorimotor activity of a young infant, because infants are very active, right through to, well, what is adulthood? For Piaget, being an adult meant being a rational being. And this is very much part of that cognitive turn, the emerging picture of mind that's coming out of generative linguistics, computational theory of mind, and now Piagetian development, emphasizes one's intellectual abilities, particularly the ability to reason, so that mathematical reasoning is seen sort of as the highest achievement of the person. One could object, one could strongly object, but this is very much part and parcel of the entire cognitivist picture. So Piaget wanted to go from the kicking, mewling, punching, crawling infant to a reasoning machine who could deal with rationality, who could think logically and in the abstract, who could infer categories and make generalizations across those categories. I also don't want you to think that everybody who's in this cognitive camp is the same. They most certainly are not, but there are certain themes that go with that particular approach to cognition, and rationality and intellectual development is definitely one of those. What is perhaps more unique to Piaget is his constructivism. He looked very, very carefully at children. He realized that they were meaning-making machines, that everything they did enriched their lives, and as they did so, they kind of made sense of it. And so as they became masters of the immediate physical environment that they were touching and engaging with physically, so they came to grasp concepts like space and time. Now, when we were discussing Kant in the history of philosophy of mind, For Kant, space and time just had to be kind of there because you couldn't make sense of anything unless you could understand things as being spatially extended, as having duration and such. For Piaget, space and time are things that you master gradually and slowly. You come to understand them and to have a facility with them. And this gradual process is known as constructivism. There are many flavors of constructivism. Constructivist approaches come in quite a wide variety. But this is one of them. And the idea is that the world is not simply given, but you come to acquire a mastery over the world through your interaction with its various parts. He wasn't much of an experimental psychologist, I'll say. Piaget wasn't prone to taking undergraduates and sticking them in white rooms and making them learn off word lists or anything like this. Most of his work he did by observing his own kids. It was detailed, descriptive, thoughtful work in which he tried to document what changes were taking place within the child, in which sequence, at what time. And by looking at a few children, I forget how many children he had, but he had more than one, you get a sense of, well, what is a fixed sequence, which bits can be optionally moved around a little bit. And he came down to identifying a couple of stages from the infant to the adult, in which there's a general progression. And the general progression is from a simple hands-on, concrete physical engagement with one's surroundings, as one might assume a very young infant has, to the development of highly intellectual, complex, abstract thought. That's, for Piaget, the end goal. I emphasize again, one could object that that is not the end goal for all humans at all times, that this might be a specifically Western, European kind of obsession. But for Piaget, this is the path he wanted to trace out. And he did so by identifying 4 stages. Now, I don't care too much whether you learn exactly these stages, their names and their boundaries between them, but you should know what the game is here. These 4 stages, you see, they go from 0 up to about 15. The idea being that then you're kind of formed. And the first stage, he's called the sensorimotor stage, from 0 to 2. Now that 2 identifies a very significant barrier. This is a pre-linguistic being. That is to say, it's not a language user. It is a being who's immersed in language. There are linguistic influences even in utero. So even when you're in the womb, you do hear language and you are sensitively learning about properties of the language in the ambient environment. But not until about 2 that you become a language user in the strict sense. That's the sensorimotor stage. Then from 2 to 7 forms a really, really important stage in which you kind of lay the basis for this highly valorized intellectual activity, but you're not there yet at all. This is what in contemporary Irish society would be early primary school. And I think teachers, so these stages are well built into our curriculum so that this corresponds fairly well to what we would call kindergarten, junior infants, senior infants, and maybe a bit of first class, but you don't start too much book learning here. Now, in the concrete operational stage, we're going to do the kind of book learning that takes you up until you're ready to go to what we would call in Ireland secondary school. And that's where we're going to lay it on heavy with grammars and mathematics and all that kind of junk. Until after the intercert, what's it called now, the junior cert, then you would be sort of grown up. When I describe it like that, you can see that this kind of thinking has been influential in society. It's hard to find a Western European society that doesn't treat these 4 stages rather differently from one another. So these have been very, very influential. And the idea is that at each stage, if we view the child as a system which is encountering novel experiences, is generating and just having novel experiences all the time that force it to adapt. So there's change going on all the time, but that change can be manifest within the child in sort of two ways. Assimilation is when you encounter a new situation, but it makes kind of sense, and you can slot it into your existing kind of stuff. So to put it in really caricature term, if you've met green fire trucks and red fire trucks, now you encounter a blue fire truck, that's no biggie. It'll fit into your world fairly well. Now you've got a bigger world in which you can envisage blue fire trucks as well, but you didn't have to really change the very core of your being in any way. That's what he would call assimilation. On the other hand, sometimes you encounter something that really does change you and forces you to reorganize, as it were, your categories, the terms in which you understand the world. So if you'd previously only been aware that there were things that you could pick up and throw around, and now suddenly you realize, oh my God, this is like a vehicle, this is like something outside. And then you go, oh my God, there's cars and there's trucks and there's boats. Now you've got a whole bunch of new categories to think about the world, and now you will encounter novel situations, you will interpret them differently. You have available to you new structures. That's the processes of accommodation. The words are not very revealing, I'm afraid. But the idea is to distinguish between novelty that is unsurprising and that you can deal with, and novelty that causes a shift in the mental structures and processes assumed to underlie your experience and your behavior. The idea being that these four stages, if you were to do a more careful analysis, we would find within a stage mostly assimilation. Things are going along and you're learning in a particular mode, as it were, in a particular key. But sometimes, your experience gets richer and you acquire new skills, or you recognize new things in the world. You're capable of making discriminations that now give you new categories for thinking, give you new skills for engaging with the world, and that change you thereby. So we just walk through those four stages briefly. The sensorimotor stage is all about touching, mouthing. Infants use their mouths an awful lot in this stage. They're only interacting with stuff that's there. And as everybody knows who's ever played peekaboo with an infant, they don't have a great notion of object permanence. If something is there, that's great. If it's gone, but they don't expect it to reappear suddenly. And this object persistence is something that you can test for in an infant, and this is a kind of way, if you're thinking along Piagetian lines, this is the way you would approach human development, is you'd look for these tests which you can administer and look to see, can you identify a threshold before which the child makes a decision one way, and after which they react differently. So object permanence is one of these classic things. Another example is as you pour a volume of liquid from one container into another, and the containers are of different sorts. Some is tall and thin, some fat and wide. Kids at an early stage think that whatever's tallest will contain the most liquid, irrespective of how wide it is. And then at some stage they begin to realize the volume is conserved in liquid as you pour, and so that the same volume of liquid can be had in a tall, thin container or a short, wide container. So these are the kind of tests you can do, so beloved of developmental psychologists, because they serve to articulate an expected pathway of progression onto which we can then tackle educational curricula. We can tack educational curricula on there. We can develop tests in order to distinguish what you might call normally functioning children from abnormally functioning children, delayed development. So a huge normative framework just came into view right now with this, which is endemic in educational psychology. I mean, this is one reason we have psychologists, is to provide this kind of guide holes. This is where it comes from. And we need to be very careful with it. And the next stage, this is the sort of lower primary school stage, we have object permanence, and now the child is also a language user, and so we get a symbolic vocabulary, a symbolic capacity, in which we use symbols, but we don't necessarily use them in a very boring, conservative, constrained way. You're all familiar with the kind of thought, fanciful and wishful thinking around here. And also the mastery of time is very limited here. When I say mastery of time, that is the ability to fall into step with the way that we adults master time. So anyone who's walked a child through of this age through the approach of Christmas will be familiar with only 5 more times sleeping, only 4 more times sleeping, only 3. You have to do this kind of thing in order to shape expectations, because what for us, we live our lives with clocks and alarms and schedules and weekends and months and holidays and so on. None of that's available to a young child. You know, it takes a long time to fall in with that. The Piagetian concern of the development of reasoning would observe that there is some kind of reasoning possible, so a flagrant contradiction or a violation or a paradox will occasion surprise, but only if it arises in the here and now. So if you appear to show 2 objects occupying the same space, for example, which you can do with holograms and such like, then the child will be very surprised at this stage. But the reasoning is restricted to what's in the here and now, and not about what might happen in fanciful, counterfactual worlds, or in the past or in the future. As we move up then, and we get to the higher echelons of primary school these days, we reach the so-called concrete operational stage, in which we get a greater ability to think in the abstract and to reason in the abstract. But such reasoning is, well, you can see the agenda here, supported by practical physical aids. Now, there's a kind of primary school teacher that tries to avoid this. So as a reader, I remember as a kid, I always used my finger. I'm grown up, I still use my bloody finger, and no one's going to stop me, and it's a great way to do things. Some kids learn to reason, to do their mathematics, their arithmetic, using an abacus. If you're a really skilled abacus user, I believe you reach a stage where you can do without the abacus, and you're doing mental abacus stuff in your head. I've never got there. But most abacus users retain the abacus. It doesn't make them stupid in any way. However, the use of practical physical supports to reasoning is something that we can all use at any stage in our lives, but is absolutely essential at this point in time. And the kind of skills that allow you then to lift off and do things like mental arithmetic, or forward planning, any kind of great amount of abstract forward planning in your head, that comes later. That comes with the so-called formal operational stage, and this is when we first introduce real mathematical constructs, for example, and where the rudiments of logic and reason are laid down. You can see the Piagetian focus here. Piaget understands humans as progressing from a kind of a sensorimotor engagement with the world, almost like an animal, to an abstract intellectual individual capable of reasoning without recourse to physical things. It's a particular kind of worldview, and it was extremely influential in developing theories of human infant development in the 50s and 60s, and you can see its mark all over the educational curriculum now. But we want to contrast Piaget with Vygotsky. And Vygotsky is going to take a very, very different turn. Vygotsky's seminal work is called Thought and Language, or sometimes Thought and Speech, depending on the translation. And it wasn't published until 1962. So he can't have made such a big influence. Vygotsky is very much behind an awful lot of the educational reforms you would see now, which things like peer-supported learning. We have an advanced learning lab here at the end where people work in circles and they work together with minimal intrusion by the teacher, for example. These would be very much coming from the Vygotskyan school. So there was very much a delayed introduction of these ideas. And guess what? There's an awful lot more from that period of Soviet science that is only now filtering into non-Russian science. Luria is very well known in the study of memory. We'll meet Bernstein when we study movement. Leontev, Bakhtin, there's a whole bunch. A school called activity theory that grew out of Vygotsky's work was extremely important. And these are only come to the awareness of researchers in Western Europe and in America now. Well, it's been an extended process. But certainly there was a two-culture thing going on here for 40, 50 years at least. Vygotsky, as we advertise now, emphasizes the scaffolding role of interaction, interpersonal interaction in learning. All learning is done in a social context. And when you come to look at kids in this way, you see different things. You don't see the maturation of an abstract mathematician. You see someone who is in and of society. An awful lot of the kinds of abilities and skills that Vygotsky tracked first appeared in the public sphere. They first appear out in public, done in conjunction with someone else. And as the child becomes more familiar with them, then the child slowly, as it were, achieves the mastery to be able to do this themselves. And they slowly internalize these capacities. These capacities are at first only available in a social situation and in conjunction with others. He introduced this very evocative and now influential notion of the zone of proximal development. The idea is that at any given stage in a child's development, there's stuff that they can do on their own, but they can do a whole lot more together with their competent peers or with a caretaker. This is not really focused on adults telling kids what to do or adults having more knowledge. The idea is simply that the kid can achieve more together with other people. That's why the competent peer is probably more important here. So at any given stage, there's going to be skills the child has already mastered and is internalized and can draw on when they're on their own, but there's lots more that they can do together with other people, and that's a constantly shifting set. That's why we call it the zone of proximal development. It's a very abstract idea. This is not a physical space, right? And this is not something you can clearly tabulate, but the idea is that things are always moving through here, and it's a mistake, so that you can immediately see consequences for any approach to education, which is to insist that a child be able to do something on their own. Ab initio is just plumb wrong. This is how we learn everything, is together. And it slowly becomes internalized. Vygotsky was very aware of the rich significance of the objects around us. So these are all cultural objects that are some more familiar than others. If you're Jewish, the dreidel is probably very familiar, but if you're not, it might be unfamiliar. But I defy any of you to to claim that the door is a weird object that you've never met before. The birthday cake is clearly a cultural object that comes with a whole bunch of practices and so on. It's steeped in significance. It's not just a thing. The world around us is populated by things which speak of the webs of social relations that we live in. They are never just dead things for Vygotsky. Meaning is made conjointly through these practices, the birthday cake, for example, but also the carpentry practices and engineering practices that give us doors within a society in which it's accepted that we have an interface of a particular kind. Meaning arises always out in the open and in these interpersonal practices for Vygotsky, and only later is it internalized. He paid particular attention to the development of speech and language, even though he only had a couple of years. So Vygotsky's psychological career is remarkably short. I think it's only about 6 or 7 years in which he produces his major works. He did, unlike Piaget, who had decades to follow his children and other children. Nevertheless, he managed to make some incredibly useful observations. In looking at language and thought, remember when we were doing language, I said, what's language for? And you all came up with communication, but we had to sort of prompt you to say, oh yeah, it's also for thinking with. It's a useful way of thinking. Well, Vygotsky was very aware of this, and furthermore, he emphasized that when children are young, there is no such distinction. And this is really interesting. It's very interesting because the word thought is one of those diabolical, dreadful words like mind and cognition that will never admit of any proper definition in this course. Okay? We have nothing to offer you if you want to find out about cognition, minds, or thought, because these are terribly defined words. However, when we look at the role of speech and language, we can see something of this. We can do better than nothing. We can observe, as Vygotsky did, that young children speak and think out loud. They have to learn to internalize the voice. They have to learn to speak with the inside voice, as it were. And it's only after you've mastered that the style of reasoning, linguistic-like thinking that you master and becomes your own with your own idiosyncratic stamp on it and so on, this kind of compression and the shortcuts. I mean, you develop your own mental world, as it were, but you do so only after you've learned to inhibit the process of just blurting out and speaking everything that comes to mind. We also noted when we were doing language that joint attention is probably extremely important as we come to understand how language facilitates the development of shared worlds. You remember Tomasello's observation that the one biological change that we knew had happened between now and 5 or 6 million years ago, when the last common ancestor of the chimpanzee, the bonobo, and the human existed. The one biological change we know of that we can clearly see is the development of the white of the eye, which provides an extremely strong social signal so that infants and carers are always paying attention to the same thing, and infants indeed learn very quickly to manipulate their caregivers' attention. So the joint attention, this kind of social situation in which we jointly pay attention and frame a situation in the same way so that we see similar opportunities, perceive threats in a similar way. This is unique to humans and is probably extremely important, all important, we might almost say, in the development, both from an evolutionary sense and within an individual, of language. Piaget wouldn't have seen this, because Piaget is looking at the kid as disconnected from everything. The kid, as if the kid had a program inside, which fits a kind of a 1980s view of genetics. Vygotsky is increasingly important as we realize that all learning is social, all coming into being of humans is social. So they represent a very good pair of landmarks. And it's not the case that one of them is right and one of them is wrong. But both of them provide us with insights that guide normative practices within society. And we have to be very, very careful here. If you establish a norm, if you say, for example, I'm a scientist person, and I'm after finding out that kids learn language by age X. They produce sentences with an average length of 4 words by age X. You just created a norm, which means you just created a class of disabled people. Right? It's an inherently political act. To be normative is always to be political. There's no way around it. And that's not to say that they shouldn't be political, but that one needs to bear in mind, particularly when one establishes something as being characteristic of normal development, thereby creating the class of abnormal development, that there are consequences to such a thing. So both of these notions, the zone of proximal development, this scaffolding by peers particularly, and the idea of fixed developmental sequences as we transition from one stage to the next, which are indexed by these kind of diagnostic tests, like the test of object permanence or volume conservation. Both of these are important, and they're very, very useful, and they inform an awful lot of teacher training and education. So here, for example, this is a fairly recent book. We see Scaffolding Children's Learning, Vygotsky in Early Childhood Education. So they do have an awful lot of clout. I hope you can see, they come at the person in very different ways. Their understanding of what a person is could almost not be more different. They had a great respect for each other, but they were from such different cultures with such different presuppositions that there's no single story you can tell that will unify these approaches. We probably need very many more sufficiently distant landmarks in order to shine a light on person. I don't know what the right answer ever is